Another tissue of self-serving lies, mostly, I suspect. We don't know yet, but most of it looks like the Oprah interview, just another load of unsubstantiated smears.
For years, the public believed they had already heard every royal scandal worth hearing, every betrayal worth debating, every family fracture worth dissecting. But inside the corridors of Buckingham Palace, behind carefully rehearsed smiles and perfectly timed public appearances, a very different conversation had quietly been unfolding, one that almost nobody outside palace walls was ever supposed to hear. Because according to multiple insiders, what finally pushed King Charles III to his breaking point was not one dramatic interview, not one explosive documentary, and not even one best-selling memoir. It was a pattern. A pattern that stretched back much further than the world realizes. Long before Netflix contracts, before California mansions, before the headlines accusing the monarchy of cruelty, there were private warnings, uncomfortable reports, and internal conversations that now, piece by piece, are beginning to paint a picture far more calculated than the public love story anyone was ever sold. And if what palace insiders are now quietly admitting is true, then this was never a modern fairy tale. It was strategy. And the first signs may have appeared years before Prince Harry even realized he was part of it. Because when the world first met Meghan Markle, the narrative seemed almost too perfect to question. A self-made actress, ambitious but relatable, independent but compassionate, a woman who claimed she knew almost nothing about Britain's most famous family, a woman who supposedly walked into royalty without expectations, without preparation, without any understanding of what that life would demand. It was believable. It was polished. And for a while, it worked. But then small contradictions started surfacing. Not all at once. Not loudly. Quietly. The kind of contradictions that, on their own, seem insignificant, until they begin forming a pattern impossible to ignore. Because years before she ever stepped inside Kensington Palace, before engagement photos, before interviews, before global adoration, there were already signs that image mattered more than authenticity. And those who worked with her in Hollywood remember it clearly. One casting director would later describe an audition that seemed completely ordinary until one simple question changed everything. Union membership. A standard requirement. A routine industry question. Nothing controversial. Nothing complicated. And yet, according to multiple entertainment insiders, the answer given that day was not true. A small lie. Almost forgettable. Almost harmless. Unless, of course, it was the beginning of something much larger. Because what happened next would establish a pattern that critics now say followed her all the way from Los Angeles to London. The role was secured. The opportunity remained. And somehow, instead of consequences, the system adapted around her. That may sound minor, until you realize what came next. Because while the public believed they were meeting Meghan for the very first time through television screens and magazine covers, people who knew her years earlier were beginning to notice something strange. Even her name wasn't exactly what the public thought. Her legal name, Rachel. Rachel Meghan Markle. A detail most people still do not know. A detail that might mean nothing, or everything. Because according to authors who spent years examining her rise, the transformation from Rachel to Meghan wasn't simply branding. It was identity construction. And once you start looking through that lens, other details suddenly become impossible to unsee. Her public origin story. Her carefully framed childhood. The narrative of struggle. The image of resilience. The suggestion that she built everything on her own. An inspiring story. Until records, photographs, school archives, and former colleagues began revealing something very different. A father deeply connected to Hollywood. Years spent on professional television sets. Private education most aspiring actresses could only dream of. Industry access from childhood. Connections people spend decades trying to build. And suddenly the outsider narrative began looking less like reality and more like presentation. But here's where palace officials reportedly began paying very close attention. Because image management in Hollywood is expected. Image management inside the British monarchy is something else entirely. And by the time Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, began quietly observing what insiders described as unusual inconsistencies, questions were already being asked behind closed doors. Questions nobody was prepared to answer. Not yet. Because what investigators would allegedly uncover next had nothing to do with acting, nothing to do with ambition, and everything to do with a carefully erased digital past. A digital history that disappeared, almost overnight. And according to those who managed to archive it in time, what was deleted may explain everything. And when Prince Harry finally discovered what some of those deleted posts allegedly revealed, palace insiders say the damage had already been done. And what happened next changed this family forever. By the time the relationship between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was beginning to move beyond private dinners, discreet flights, and carefully protected meetings away from public cameras, something else was happening quietly in the background, something the public would not discover until years later. Because while newspapers were still chasing photographs and tabloids were still trying to confirm whether the romance was even real, researchers, biographers, former colleagues, archived web, investigators, and eventually even individuals connected to palace security assessments had already started piecing together a digital trail that raised a question almost nobody in the mainstream media seemed prepared to ask. Was this relationship truly an unexpected collision of two very different worlds, or had one side been studying that world far longer than anyone realized? The first real alarm reportedly came not from a leaked message, not from an angry former friend, and not from some explosive anonymous source trying to sell a headline, but from something much quieter, much less dramatic, and in many ways much more revealing, because the more investigators began revisiting Meghan's digital history, the more one project kept resurfacing as the key to understanding what may have been happening long before the public knew her name beyond a supporting role on television. That project was the TIG. To casual readers, it looked harmless, polished, aspirational, and entirely on-brand for an actress slowly building her profile in a competitive industry, filled with luxury hotels, private resorts, designer wardrobes, candlelit dinners, wellness philosophies, curated friendships, inspirational quotes, photographs of handwritten notes, expensive wines, global travel, and carefully selected glimpses into a life that appeared effortless, sophisticated, and deeply connected. But to people trained to study behavior patterns, image construction, and long-term public positioning, the TIG began to look less like a lifestyle blog and more like a live document of ambition unfolding in real time. Because hidden between travel guides, fashion recommendations, and carefully written reflections about purpose, growth, and identity, there appeared to be something else. An unusually precise attraction toward elite environments, influential circles, inherited institutions, old-world prestige, and the kind of social architecture that most people only admire from a distance. And perhaps none of that would have raised serious questions if the blog had simply remained online. But it did not. In 2017, at almost the exact moment the relationship with Prince Harry began transitioning from private companionship into something that palace officials could no longer dismiss as temporary, the entire project disappeared. Hundreds of entries, years of photographs, years of written thoughts, years of personal observations, years of digital footprints. Gone. Not slowly, not partially, not after public criticism, not after marriage, not after a scandal, almost overnight. And according to multiple individuals who had been archiving public content long before the deletion occurred, the timing was so precise that even experienced royal correspondents quietly began asking whether the deletion had been personal or strategic. Because when something disappears that quickly, the first question is never what was removed. The first question is always why. And when recovered archives allegedly began circulating among researchers and biographers, the answers only became more complicated. Some archived posts reportedly showed a long-standing fascination with London society. Some allegedly referenced aristocratic culture with surprising familiarity. Some reportedly contained observations about inherited status, historical institutions, and the kind of social symbolism deeply associated with Britain's upper circles. Some allegedly reflected admiration for women who had successfully navigated elite power structures through image, discipline, and strategic visibility. Now, to be absolutely responsible, not every archived claim has been independently verified in full context, and some interpretations remain strongly disputed. But what cannot be disputed is this: the deletion happened, the timing was real, and the people whose job it was to protect the monarchy reportedly took notice. And what they discovered next made the situation even harder to ignore. Because while the public was eventually told a story built around a mutual friend, one blind date, and one simple question: is he kind? Investigators mapping social circles, event attendance, professional relationships, and private memberships found a network that looked far more interconnected than the public narrative ever suggested. The center of that network was Soho House. To outsiders, Soho House appears to be little more than an exclusive hospitality brand designed for celebrities, entrepreneurs, and creatives. To people inside international influence networks, it is something much more powerful. A private ecosystem where money, access, reputation, media influence, political relationships, aristocratic connections, and cultural capital quietly intersect without cameras, without journalists, and without public accountability. And according to numerous reports from individuals familiar with those circles, Meghan was not an occasional visitor. She was established, comfortable, recognized, connected. She knew producers. She knew photographers. She knew fashion executives. She knew publicists. She knew individuals with direct proximity to European social circles. And perhaps most importantly, she reportedly knew people who knew Harry personally. Not casually. Personally. Friends. Mutual acquaintances. Private introductions. Shared events. Overlapping invitations. Exclusive gatherings where titles mattered less than trust. And once those timelines were mapped side by side, some investigators began noticing that what the public later accepted as coincidence began looking increasingly difficult to describe as accidental. Again, none of that proves intent. None of that proves planning. None of that proves targeting. But it does complicate the official story. Because if someone truly knew nothing about Prince Harry, knew nothing about his world, knew nothing about Britain's royal institution, then how did so many social pathways appear to exist long before the so-called blind date ever happened? And according to individuals familiar with early palace discussions, this was exactly the kind of question that began quietly circulating behind closed doors. Not publicly, not emotionally, not dramatically, strategically, methodically, professionally. Because inside the monarchy, personal relationships are never treated as purely personal. They are assessed. They are documented. They are evaluated. And as those evaluations reportedly continued, one senior figure is said to have become increasingly cautious, Prince William. According to multiple royal biographers, William's concerns were never framed as hostility, jealousy, or disapproval. They were framed as timing, pace, risk, institutional consequence. He reportedly encouraged Harry to slow down. He reportedly suggested giving the relationship more time. He reportedly advised learning more before making permanent commitments. Not because he opposed love. Not because he opposed change. But because he understood something Harry, by many accounts, was emotionally struggling to accept, that anyone marrying into the House of Windsor is never simply joining a family. They are joining an institution older than most nations. And institutions do not survive on emotion alone. But by the time those conversations allegedly began taking place, something else was already making the timeline even more uncomfortable. Because while Harry believed he was entering the most important relationship of his life, investigators studying private records, public appearances, Toronto social circles, and professional connections were beginning to notice another name appearing again and again. A man from Canada. A serious relationship. A shared home. A public life. And if the dates being quietly examined were accurate, then the official love story the world would later celebrate may have begun before the previous chapter had fully ended. And when those dates reportedly landed on palace desks, even some of the most experienced advisors are said to have stopped talking and simply started reading. By the time palace advisors had finished examining deleted archives, reconstructed social timelines, and the increasingly complex network of introductions that appeared to surround the earliest days of the relationship between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, many of the initial concerns were still being treated as caution rather than proof, as questions rather than conclusions, and as patterns rather than accusations. Because inside an institution as old and as carefully protected as the British monarchy, suspicion alone is never enough to trigger alarm. But timelines. Timelines are different, because timelines do not care about public emotion, headlines, interviews, or carefully rehearsed narratives, and once investigators began placing dates, photographs, flights, social appearances, professional obligations, and personal relationships side by side, one name kept returning to the center of the conversation with growing frequency. That name was Cory Vitiello. To the general public, the name meant almost nothing. To those following Meghan's life in Toronto before royal headlines transformed her into an international figure, Corey was not a footnote, not a casual acquaintance, and certainly not some brief dating rumor created by tabloids looking for clicks. By nearly every available account, he was something much more serious. They were seen together consistently. They attended private dinners. They moved in overlapping social circles. Friends described them as committed. Industry insiders described them as stable. People close to Toronto's hospitality and entertainment scene reportedly viewed them not as two people casually exploring a relationship, but as two ambitious professionals building something with genuine long-term potential. And perhaps most significantly of all, by multiple accounts, they were living together. That detail mattered. Not because living together proves permanence. Not because relationships never end. But because it made what investigators discovered next significantly more complicated. Because according to publicly available timelines, social records, and multiple biographies that later examined this period in extraordinary detail, Meghan's relationship with Corey did not appear to fade gradually over months in some slow emotional transition that might naturally lead to another chapter. Instead, the timeline appeared compressed. Uncomfortably compressed. Compressed enough that even experienced royal correspondents began quietly asking whether one relationship had truly ended before another one began. Now, to be absolutely transparent, exact private dates remain disputed, and responsible reporting requires acknowledging that no official public statement has ever fully clarified the overlap in precise detail. But what cannot be disputed is that by spring and summer of 2016, the public narrative was moving very quickly, and the people responsible for evaluating personal risk inside Kensington Palace were reportedly paying very close attention. Because while Harry believed he was living out a love story built on spontaneity, chemistry, and emotional honesty, investigators looking at calendars, flights, professional appearances, Toronto dinner reservations, and private introductions were seeing something else. A transition so clean. A pivot so efficient. A shift so strategically timed. That some began wondering whether emotional momentum had been building on one side long before the official beginning anyone was eventually told. And this is where internal concerns reportedly began moving beyond simple curiosity. Because according to individuals familiar with early palace reviews, the issue was no longer social media. The issue was no longer deleted blogs. The issue was no longer elite social memberships. The issue was behavioral consistency. And consistency, once broken repeatedly, becomes impossible for institutions to ignore. As investigators looked deeper, former colleagues reportedly began describing something increasingly familiar. An unusual awareness of visibility. An unusual awareness of social hierarchy. An unusual awareness of who mattered in a room. An unusual ability to adapt personality depending on who was watching. Again, none of that is illegal. None of that is uncommon in Hollywood. None of that automatically suggests manipulation. But when such observations begin appearing alongside overlapping relationships, carefully deleted digital histories, elite social access, and rapidly accelerating emotional commitments involving a prince whose emotional vulnerabilities were already widely understood by those closest to him, the conversation changes. And according to multiple royal biographers, it did. By this stage, Prince William was reportedly no longer simply advising caution. He was reportedly asking direct questions. Measured questions. Necessary questions. Questions any future monarch would be expected to ask when the sixth in line to the throne appeared ready to make a life-changing commitment faster than anyone around him considered wise. Was enough time being taken? Was enough background being understood? Was enough history being verified? Was enough emotional distance being preserved? They were not romantic questions. They were institutional questions. And by multiple accounts, Harry did not take them well. Because for a man who had spent much of his life feeling misunderstood, overprotected, compared, analyzed, and publicly judged, any attempt to slow him down may have felt less like family concern, and more like interference. And if that emotional tension inside the family was already beginning to build, what happened next would take the situation far beyond private concern. Because once Meghan's interactions with palace staff allegedly began increasing, a very different set of observations reportedly started emerging. Observations from people with nothing to gain. Observations from assistants. schedulers, protection officers, household coordinators, communications staff, people whose careers depended on discretion, people who almost never speak publicly, people trained to observe, document, and remain invisible. And according to multiple later reports, some of those individuals began noticing something deeply uncomfortable. The public warmth did not always match the private environment. In meetings, the charm was reportedly immediate. The eye contact was reportedly strong. The language was reportedly polished. The confidence was reportedly undeniable. But according to people later cited in biographical accounts, the atmosphere sometimes changed the moment doors closed. Requests became firmer. Expectations became sharper. Corrections became more frequent. Timelines became more demanding. Sensitivity to image became increasingly visible. And for staff who had spent years navigating complex royal personalities without major incident, some of these early interactions reportedly felt different. Not dramatic enough to trigger scandal. Not explosive enough to create headlines. But memorable enough that notes were allegedly taken. And in royal households, written observations matter. Because written observations become records. Records become patterns. Patterns become institutional memory. And institutional memory, once established, rarely disappears. By the time Harry was becoming more emotionally invested, by the time media speculation was intensifying, by the time engagement rumors were beginning to circulate internationally, there were reportedly already individuals inside palace structures quietly wondering whether the greatest risk was not public controversy, but private influence. Because according to one senior biographer, what some advisors feared most was not that Meghan wanted visibility. Visibility could be managed. Visibility could be controlled. Visibility could be integrated. What worried them was the growing possibility that Harry himself was beginning to change. Faster than expected. More defensively than expected. More emotionally isolated than expected. And when family members allegedly began noticing those changes, private concern slowly started becoming private alarm. Because what came next would no longer involve old relationships, deleted blogs, or social clubs. What came next would involve palace employees, internal complaints, emotional fallout, and allegations so serious that even senior members of the royal household would eventually be forced to pay attention. And when the first formal concerns reportedly reached the desks of those closest to King Charles III, the family realized this was no longer simply a romance. It was becoming a crisis. By the time concerns surrounding staff interactions, emotional isolation, accelerated decision-making, and increasingly uncomfortable internal observations began moving through the private channels of Kensington Palace, senior members of the royal household were no longer dealing with isolated impressions, awkward first encounters, or the kind of personality clashes that naturally occur whenever someone new enters an institution built on centuries of hierarchy, protocol, and carefully controlled tradition, because what had initially been dismissed as cultural adjustment, Hollywood confidence, or simple misunderstandings was now beginning to generate something much harder to ignore: documentation. And inside the monarchy, documentation changes everything. A difficult conversation can be forgotten. An emotional disagreement can be repaired. A misunderstanding can be reframed. But written records create institutional memory. And according to multiple royal biographers, journalists with long-standing palace sources, and individuals who later examined internal timelines in extraordinary detail, by late 2018 the concerns surrounding Meghan Markle were no longer being described as occasional tension. They were allegedly being described as a pattern involving communication, a pattern involving expectations, a pattern involving emotional pressure, a pattern involving people whose careers had been built around serving some of the most demanding public figures in the world, yet who were now reportedly describing an atmosphere that felt fundamentally different from anything they had experienced before. And when multiple observations begin pointing in the same direction, institutions listen. Because according to reports that would eventually surface years later, palace staff members had allegedly begun describing interactions that left them emotionally drained, professionally unsettled, and increasingly uncertain about how routine conversations might unfold behind closed doors. Not because voices were always raised, Not because dramatic scenes were constantly unfolding. Not because public scandal had erupted. But because unpredictability, when repeated often enough, can create its own form of pressure. One assistant reportedly described waking up anxious before morning briefings. Another reportedly described late-night communications that created an atmosphere of constant urgency. Others allegedly described an environment where nothing ever felt finished, where every completed task risked immediate revision, and where even small details connected to public image, wardrobe, travel arrangements, photography, scheduling, messaging, and appearance could suddenly become subjects of intense scrutiny. Now, to be absolutely clear, many of these reports remain based on biographical accounts, anonymous sources, and internal claims rather than publicly released official transcripts, and responsible reporting requires acknowledging that not every allegation has been independently verified in full context. But what cannot be ignored is what happened next. Because once enough internal concerns reportedly accumulated, someone made a decision that would later become one of the most discussed moments in modern royal history. They put concerns in writing. And according to accounts later cited by royal correspondents, one of the most significant internal warnings allegedly came from a senior palace official who believed the emotional well-being of junior staff could no longer be treated as a private issue. That official was reportedly concerned enough to document observations, raise alarms through formal channels, and encourage senior leadership to take the situation seriously before lasting damage occurred. At first, these warnings reportedly remained private, confidential, contained, institutional, handled exactly the way sensitive family matters are usually handled inside royal households. But privately handling a concern only works when the concern stops growing. And according to multiple sources, this one did not. Because as months passed, another pattern allegedly began emerging. Turnover. Unexpected turnover. Unusually rapid turnover. People leaving roles they had spent years building. People requesting transfers. People stepping away from positions once considered career-defining opportunities. And while staff changes happen in every large institution, palace observers reportedly began noticing something unusual about the timing. Too many departures. Too quickly. Too consistently. Too close together. And by this stage, some advisors reportedly began asking a far more uncomfortable question. Was this simply personality conflict, or was something inside the household becoming unsustainable? While those conversations were happening behind closed doors, the public, of course, saw something completely different. They saw smiling photographs. They saw hand-holding. They saw glamorous tours. They saw headlines celebrating modern love, global popularity, and a supposedly revitalized monarchy. They saw Australia. They saw Fiji. They saw crowds. They saw cheering supporters. They saw perfect camera angles. They saw chemistry. They saw confidence. And for millions of viewers, the story still looked flawless. But insiders now claim that some of the most difficult moments were happening precisely during those same high-profile tours. When public appearances stretched for hours, international schedules became exhausting, and pressure inside the traveling household intensified. Because according to later accounts from individuals allegedly familiar with those trips, some staff members reportedly found themselves navigating not only the logistical demands of international diplomacy, but increasingly complex emotional dynamics behind hotel doors, in private vehicles, in temporary offices, and in the narrow invisible spaces where royal image is carefully maintained. And perhaps nowhere did those concerns reportedly become more visible than in the growing tension between households. Because what started as professional caution between Prince William and Prince Harry was now, according to multiple biographers, beginning to evolve into something much deeper. Mistrust. Not public hostility. Not dramatic confrontation. But quiet mistrust. Mistrust built through unanswered questions. Mistrust built through conflicting stories. Mistrust built through emotional defensiveness. Mistrust built through a growing sense that conversations which once came naturally between brothers now required careful navigation. And according to individuals close to the family, Harry was becoming increasingly protective, increasingly reactive, increasingly suspicious of criticism, increasingly convinced that any concern raised by family members, advisors, or staff was not institutional caution, but personal attack. That emotional shift mattered. Because once emotional loyalty begins replacing objective evaluation, institutions lose influence. And according to several royal insiders, this was precisely the moment when family conversations allegedly became far more difficult. Because Harry no longer appeared to be asking whether concerns were valid. He appeared increasingly focused on who was raising them. And when that happens inside a family already carrying decades of public trauma, media pressure, and unresolved emotional history, conflict rarely stays private for long. By the end of that year, according to several royal analysts, two very different realities were now unfolding at the same time. In public, the monarchy appeared modern, unified, and globally admired. In private, relationships were becoming strained, staff morale was reportedly under pressure, internal warnings were allegedly circulating, and family conversations were becoming increasingly tense. And then something happened that changed the balance completely. Because for the first time, concerns that had previously remained behind palace walls allegedly began intersecting with a far bigger issue. Media strategy, narrative control, public sympathy. And according to people familiar with what happened next, once discussions shifted from private family dynamics to global media influence, the situation stopped being an internal challenge and started becoming a battle for public perception. A battle that would soon involve interviews, documentaries, accusations, broken trust, and a conversation that would leave even King Charles III facing one of the most painful decisions of his life. Because what happened next was no longer about joining the monarchy. It was about confronting it. By the time private concerns, internal documentation, staff turnover, emotional distance between brothers, and the growing collapse of trust inside Kensington Palace had begun creating pressure that even senior advisors could no longer quietly contain, one truth was becoming painfully clear to everyone involved. This was no longer simply a complicated royal marriage, no longer a difficult cultural adjustment, and no longer a private disagreement that time, patience, and institutional discipline could naturally repair. Because what had started as personal tension was now evolving into something infinitely more dangerous for an institution built entirely on continuity, stability, and public confidence. It was becoming a war of narratives. And in the modern world, narratives can wound institutions faster than scandals ever could. Because while the House of Windsor had survived abdications, divorces, leaked tapes, tabloid wars, constitutional crises, and decades of relentless public scrutiny, it had rarely faced something quite like this. A conflict where private grievances, public image, celebrity media strategy, streaming platforms, carefully staged interviews, and global sympathy campaigns were all beginning to merge into one powerful and highly emotional public story. And according to individuals who later studied this period in extraordinary detail, the family understood something very early that the public did not. This conflict would never remain private. It was always going to explode. The only real question was when. And when it finally did, it happened with the kind of global force that instantly changed the monarchy forever. First came the distancing. Private meetings became less frequent. Shared appearances became noticeably rarer. Body language analysts began filling television screens. Journalists started noticing separate schedules. Royal correspondents began describing unusual household restructuring. And for the first time, even casual observers started sensing that something deeper was happening behind the carefully controlled smiles. Then came the departure. The announcement that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle intended to step back from royal duties did not simply shock Britain. It shocked the world. Because no matter how modern the monarchy tries to appear, one truth remains unchanged. When a senior royal walks away, the consequences are never personal alone. They become constitutional, institutional, generational. And according to multiple insiders, the speed of that announcement reportedly left even senior figures scrambling to contain the fallout. Meetings were called. Lawyers were consulted. Communications teams were mobilized. Crisis advisors were brought in. And behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, one painful realization allegedly began settling in. This was no longer about compromise. This was about damage control. Because what came next would not be negotiated privately. It would be broadcast globally. And when the now infamous interview aired, millions of viewers around the world watched as personal pain, emotional accusation, institutional criticism, and deeply sensitive family matters were transformed into international television. Tears, silence, long pauses, carefully chosen words, unanswered accusations. and allegations so emotionally powerful that entire audiences instantly began choosing sides before facts could even be examined. Some believed every word. Some questioned everything. Some saw bravery. Some saw strategy. But inside the family, according to multiple royal commentators, the damage was immediate. Because once private conversations become global entertainment, trust does not simply weaken. Trust shatters. And according to people familiar with the emotional fallout, the impact on Prince William was particularly profound. Not because of criticism. Not because of headlines. Not even because of public debate. But because family conversations, private moments, and years of shared history now appear to be competing against cameras, streaming contracts, and public sympathy. And for a man raised to believe that duty comes before emotion, that loyalty comes before comfort, and that institutions survive only when private pain remains private, this was reportedly not just disappointing. It was deeply personal. And perhaps nowhere was that emotional conflict more visible than in the silence that followed. Because despite headlines, despite documentaries, despite memoirs, despite global interviews, despite accusations, despite carefully edited narratives, the senior members of the royal family largely refused to publicly fight back. No televised rebuttals. No emotional press conferences. No point-by-point attacks. No retaliatory documentaries. Instead, there was silence. Measured silence. Strategic silence. Institutional silence. And according to individuals close to King Charles III, that silence was not weakness. It was survival. Because institutions that have survived for centuries understand something modern celebrities often do not. Today's headlines feel permanent, but history moves much slower than outrage. And yet silence does not erase pain. Because while the monarchy publicly moved forward, insiders claim private relationships continued deteriorating. Phone calls reportedly became rarer. Personal trust reportedly became harder to rebuild. Family milestones reportedly became emotionally complicated. Public appearances reportedly required even greater coordination. And every new interview, every new project, every new documentary, every new memoir excerpt, every new accusation, every new headline, reportedly reopened wounds that had never fully healed. But perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story is not the interviews, not the documentaries, not the memoirs, not the headlines, and not even the accusations. Perhaps the most revealing part is what happened afterward. Because while one side built global media partnerships, streaming deals, personal brands, podcasts, public speeches, commercial ventures, and carefully curated projects designed to tell their truth to the world, the institution they left behind kept doing what it has always done. State visits, charity work, military ceremonies, constitutional duties, diplomatic obligations, national mourning, national celebration, and above all, continuity. Because institutions do not survive by winning every argument. They survive by outlasting them. And if there is one lesson emerging from every archived interview, every deleted blog, every staff allegation, every family fracture, every carefully reconstructed timeline, every palace warning, and every emotional public confrontation examined throughout this investigation, it may be this. Sometimes the biggest royal scandals are not created by one explosive event. Sometimes they are built quietly, pattern by pattern, decision by decision, relationship by relationship, until one day the entire world finally notices what insiders may have been seeing all along. And the most uncomfortable question of all still remains unanswered. Was this always a love story that went wrong? Or was it a strategy that worked exactly as intended? That question, only history can answer. And history, as this family knows better than anyone, never stops watching. If you enjoyed this investigation, make sure you subscribe, because the next story may be even more explosive than this one. And once you see the hidden patterns behind royal headlines, you will never watch another palace appearance the same way again. Click one of the videos on your screen right now, because the deeper you go into the modern monarchy, the harder it becomes to look away.